Yá'át'ééh. Good morning, my relatives. It is just about noon here on the East Coast, and it is Monday, April 11th, and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee. And I wanted to talk about a few things as we start this week today. But before I do, as I always do, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what's now known as Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the host of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands and just state how humbled I am to be living here today. I'm going to try to make this coffee a little more brief this morning and possibly a little more interactive. So if you're online, feel free to reach out over the comment section. I'm able to engage with those a little bit. Yá'át'ééh, Phil, thanks for joining this morning. And you can see I have my trusty Bluebird flower cup with me. And yeah, I've been doing some reading, and I use the word reading lightly because I actually found out that I'm able to get through books much more quickly if I listen to them on Audible. And so I've subscribed to Audible a few months ago, and I've been able to get through a lot more books in the past few months than I have in a while, just because it's easier to listen when I'm out walking or driving around, picking up my daughters from school or doing other things, cooking, and I can just have my headphones on and be listening to a book. And so I've been doing that a lot more frequently, and I've been able to get through more content recently. But one of the books I've been reading or listening to, I guess I should say, has been this book, Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Demay. And I I have promoted this book a bit often because when you search for my book on Amazon, you'll see that frequently Amazon suggests Jesus and John Wayne and The Color of Compromise alongside my book, Unsettling Truths. And so, and Kristen teaches at the University of Calvin University. I haven't met her personally, but we follow each other on social media and engage a little bit online. And I actually would really like to have her as a guest for a second cup of coffee at some point in the future. But I wanted to make sure I took some time to listen to her book and hear what she had to say. If you follow it, there's a lot of dialogue. It's generating a lot of conversation. Um, Online, especially within white evangelical circles. And it's a it's a good book. I appreciated listening to it. At points, it's overwhelming, which is probably a good thing. It draws a lot of connection between patriarchy and misogyny and militarism and even Christian nationalism. And it deconstructs and exposes a lot of white evangelicals who, if you're around my age, especially, we kind of grew up with hearing their names being mentioned. And yet it shows how those voices, both intentionally and unintentionally, were part of this political machine that was really at work in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to um, uh, as this is so the book says the subtitle of the book says how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And so the book points out how there was a lot of damage done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even the 2000s by white evangelicals. And it references it as this fractured a nation and corrupted a faith. Now, of course, if you've read our book on selling truths, you'll know that the argument we're making is this wasn't a fracture, right? This was already broken, or this was already, I would say, working as intended. And so I would actually draw the discussion back and root it even further than the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and say this is even also rooted in the doctrine of discovery. And so, yeah, especially if you look at the militarism, the Christian nationalism, and the patriarchy, all right, those things go back in the church a long, long, long way. And so the book does what it sets out to do, which is it kind of deconstructs and it exposes what has been happening in the past few decades. It doesn't go into the root of it, but I don't think it promises it would go into the roots. And so it's a good I think this is one of the reasons why it's good. It's kind of suggested along with Unselling Truth, is because once you understand, especially the foundations, going back all the way to the creation of the heresy of Christendom, then you're able to see how, what happened in the past few decades, while horrific, is nothing new. It's just taking on a different brand or a different flavor. And so it's a good book. I would highly recommend it. And I think it shows how, and exposes a lot, how white evangelicalism and the political machine really over the past few decades have worked in partnership, in tandem with each other, to keep this system moving along and rolling along. And so I would highly recommend it. I've also been listening to I've been re-listening to a podcast. Some of you might know this podcast came out about a year ago. It ran for several months. It was by Christianity Today, titled "The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill." I don't even know how I got plugged into it, but someone promoted it, or I heard about it, and I started listening to it. Soon after it came out, in the first quarter, I think, of 2021, almost about a year ago, I think, was the first episode. And it ran like 19 episodes, I believe, for most of last year. In fact, they just had kind of an addendum episode just last week. But I was listening to this, and it's looking specifically at Mars Hill and kind of the patriarchy and misogyny of Mark Driscoll and that church, and what went on there, and how it was so damaging to white evangelicals and damaging to families and even to women. And yet, same time, it was proclaiming, but God was at work and things were happening and there was fruit being born. And as I listened to it, when I listened to it for the first time, right, the first thing that really strikes you is almost everyone they're talking about and everyone they're interviewing, with very few exceptions, are white. And right, Mars Hill kind of started in the early 2000s, and it met its heyday in around 2010, and then it began to collapse soon after that. And this was the entire time I was on the reservation with my family. In fact, it was probably starting when we were living in the Hogan. And so listening to it for me was kind of the experience of getting a perspective of what was going on in white evangelical America while we were kind of on the margins, living on the reservation and even living in the Hogan. And so, I was kind of listening to it for the first time about a year ago, and I was noticing how it's largely from the white perspective. It's largely looking not at racism, but it's looking at, and not even at the church in full, right? It's talking almost specifically about white evangelicals, and yet it's saying this is what's going on in the church. And so as I was listening to it and I was hearing the critique of it, and I was kind of disturbed at how limited the critique was, because it wasn't bringing in voices of color. It wasn't bringing in leaders of color to kind of help critique what was happening at Mars Hill. And even while it fell, it actually was using white voices, many of whom were caught up in what was going on both at Mars Hill as well as around the nation. And they were using those voices to critique what happened. And I remember thinking frequently throughout listening to it for the first time, how that conversation could be made so much more full if it brought in the perspective of the broader church, right? Not just white Christians, but the broader church, and what was going on around the country, in communities of color, and especially with Native and African American and other leaders of color. One comment they made frequently, and this is about Mark Driscoll and about Bill Hybels and about so many other of those kind of Gen X white leaders, really about my age, is how they were incredibly talented people, and yet they were given these massive platforms before they had the character to handle such a platform. And they talked about how this was a problem in the church, and even asking the question, why does the church do this? Give these massive platforms to these talented leaders before they have the character to handle it. And I remember hearing that for the first time and hearing it again as I'm listening to it now, and remembering our thinking, that's not generally the problem with leaders of color, right? I know very few leaders of color who were given a massive platform before they had some experience in ministry and had a deeper sense of vision in what they were trying to do. Most leaders of color, deeply mature leaders that I know who have a lot to say and a lot to offer the church, are actually not given much of a platform at all. And so I think the problem that they're pointing out in the rise and fall of Mars Hill is primarily it's a problem with white evangelicals with white leaders. It's not a problem in the whole of the church. And so while I was kind of listening to it for the first time, I thought we should really add some voices of color into this critique. And I began talking with a few people that I know at some conferences and over the phone and some Zoom calls. And I'm slowly putting together a lineup of some voices that I want to bring in to my second cup of coffee over the next few months, specifically leaders of color. And I want to bring in their perspective and their voice, not only about what was going on at Mars Hill, but talking about what was happening during that time period in this nation with the massive growth of megachurches and all the things that were happening there. And then what were these leaders of color doing, right? As I said before, I was on the reservation living in a hogan trying to figure out how do we bring a message like the doctrine of discovery to the entire church. And so while these white evangelical talented leaders were off building these monuments to themselves and then crashing and burning, there were numerous leaders of color who I know who were actually just as talented, who were doing things on the margins and trying to build something, and now are beginning to step in. And I would love to see them step more fully in to the work that they have been doing and are working on. And so I'm not quite sure how I'm going to frame it and how I'm going to put it all together. If I'm going to do a specific series on it, or if I'm going to go episode by episode, or just kind of talk in general, or take some broader themes. But that's why I'm re-listening to the podcast right now. I listened to several episodes yesterday, and several the day before, and a few more today. And so I'm hoping in the next week to kind of get through and then kind of outline what I want to do over my second cup of coffee, so that we can actually bring voices of color into this dialogue. Because again, white evangelicals, A, they're not the center of everything, even though they like to think they are. And B, what goes on there has absolute influence around what goes on in other communities. But there's also a lot of things that are going on really good in other communities that white evangelicals tend to just completely miss because they're so focused at their own navel gazing. And so, yeah, I really want to add, not just be only critical, but add some voices into that critique so that we can get a much fuller picture of what was happening during that period. And that led me to some other thoughts I've been having, because when you listen to, as I have done in the past week and a half, when I listen to Jesus and John Wayne, and I listen to the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and I watch what's going on in Ukraine, and I see what's happening in our political system, and there's just this kind of overwhelming sense of there's this white landowning male machine. It's political, it's religious, it's social, and it's just kind of moving forward. And it seems that almost no one is willing to hold it accountable. Very few people are willing to stand up and confront it. And it just kind of continues to move on. And it reminded me of a metaphor or an analogy that I used early on. I remember when I was on the reservation, and I was first beginning to talk about the doctrine of discovery and about how I was trying to articulate this to white Christians. And I use the metaphor of, because I would say to people, hey, this is what's happening. This damage is being done to our communities of color, and you're on this machine, and they would all express some kind of sympathy, but then they would kind of hold up their hands of like, there's really nothing I can do. And I was trying to tell people, it feels like I'm myself and other leaders of color and communities of color we're watching this kind of tank roll through, right? Our villages, or our neighborhoods, our backyards even, and it's crushing houses, it's killing people, it's crushing cars, it's causing incredible damage. Even if it's not even firing, just by the way it's rolling, it's just kind of slowly rolling and going over all these things. And we're running along the side it, telling people, stop the tank, stop the tank, stop the tank. And there's all these white people on the tank who are just like, I'm not driving and I can't stop it. And that's how it feels so often. And where people are sympathetic, but they're like, I can't help you. I feel bad about this. I feel bad that we're running over your neighborhoods and we're destroying people and we're destroying your livelihoods. I know I'm on this tank that's doing this horrible damage, but there's nothing I can do to stop it. And I tweeted something yesterday where I said, one of the challenges with whiteness, and by whiteness, I mean the social, religious, and political systems that prop up the lie of white supremacy. One of the challenges with whiteness is many white people, including a lot of white leaders, think that whiteness is too big to fail. In other words, if whiteness is allowed to fail or self-destruct or whatever it is whiteness is beginning to do to itself, right? That it does so much. It has such a reach. It has such it's such a big thing that its failure would be catastrophic, right? This is the lie that was used during the Great Recession of, well, there's these massive banks that cause these huge problems, but they're really too big to fail. So we have to give billions and billions of dollars to these banks, enriching the millionaires and billionaires behind them, because these banks, even though they cause the problem, are too big to fail. And that's a lie, right? The reason we have the problems is because they were allowed to get so big. And so when white people and even people of color believe that whiteness is too big to fail, then instead of deconstructing it or even allowing it to fail, we end up propping it up because we're more afraid of the consequences of whiteness failing than of whiteness doing what it was constructed and designed to do, which is to center itself and crush marginalized communities of color. And this is the exact same argument we're using in Russia, right? Why is NATO and the U.S. not going in and militarily protecting Ukraine? Because not only are they very aware that Putin is willing to use nuclear weapons in a global war, but Joe Biden is very aware that he doesn't have the restraint either. And I would argue, nor do the majority of the American people have the restraint to say, if we got into a conflict with Russia, that we couldn't promise it wouldn't go nuclear, right? The problem with whiteness and with these two nations that believe in the myth of their own exceptionalism is they truly believe that they can destroy the world with their nuclear weapons, and that's better than them losing. They truly believe that. We believe that as the United States of America, and Russia believes that. And so we're allowing Russia to go in and literally destroy and commit genocide in Ukraine because we know, and President Biden knows, that he doesn't have the courage to not use nuclear weapons. And he knows a majority of Americans aren't willing to go into a global conflict without committing to not using nuclear weapons. And so, as he said, yeah, if we get involved with Russia, it becomes the dangers and the possibility of nuclear engagement goes through the roof. Because neither Putin nor Biden have the self-control to not use the weapons they have at their disposal. And so we're allowing countries to get steamrolled because we don't have the self-control to not destroy the world. And this is kind of the same mentality of these things are too big to fail, right? So Russia's too big. They get to do whatever the hell they want because they believe they have not only do they believe they have the right to kill the global population, but they have the ability to do it. And the US the same way, right? And so this is where I think we see this mentality of when we acknowledge and feed into this thing of, well, we're too big to fail, then we allow these injustices to just perpetuate and move on because, well, the alternative is even more catastrophic. And this is why these systems are kept in place. This is why systemic change doesn't happen. This is why all these things move on. I'm going to share one more thing with you. And I just watched this. If you've ever watched there was an HBO series called The Newsroom, and it came out, I think, in 2012. And well, before I do that, let me share the if you want to get the Mars Hill podcast, I'm going to give a link to that in the comment section right now. And then I've seen this clip before, and I've watched it numerous times, and there's parts of it that I really like, and then there's other parts that are completely mythological and lies. And I'm going to share this with you. It's a clip from the first episode of The Newsroom. It's one of the opening scenes of the series. And I don't remember the character's name, but the main character is at this large meeting and he's kind of being interviewed. He's a news anchor and they're being interviewed and students are asking questions. And he's asked a question of, why is America the greatest country in the world? And he tries to not answer the question. And then he basically says, it's not. We're not the greatest country in the world. And he gives all of these stats, much like I've given in a lot of my lectures for the past decade, right? Of the only things we're leading at is in military spending and incarceration of our citizens. Everything else, we're subpar. And he has two kind of ending points in his little speech there. And one is he ends it kind of where I end it, which is like, we are not the greatest country in the world. And I don't know why you're asking the question. And I think if the quote ended there, the series would have not gone any further. But then he adds this whole section of, he says, but we used to be. And he lists this whole thing of, but we used to change laws for moral reasons. We used to build big things and not beat our chests. We used to, and he goes off and lists all these things about the myth of American exceptionalism. And the fascinating thing about that quote is there's so much of that quote that is absolutely true, which is we are not the greatest country in the world anymore, or period, right? But then he goes on to basically ignore all of our injustices, not only that happened in the past, but are perpetuated, and then say, but 40, 50, 60 years ago, winning World War II and all the stuff we've done since then, the past century, have been this amazing list of feats, right, that we've done as a nation. And it's like, that's not true, right? Even if you go back 30, 40 years, 50 years, right? 50, 60 years. We'll go back 50, 60 years. People of color barely had the right to vote. People of color were marching and being killed for demanding and asking for the right to vote. They were still being killed today. And so again, when you have this myth of we used to be exceptional, now we're not. That's why that I think that quote, that speech is so moving to most Americans, is because when we look at the crap we're sitting in today, people love to think back, or white people, I should say, love to think back to the 40s, 50s, the 40s and 50s, maybe even the 20s and 30s, of like, this was our heyday. This was, people of color were effectively marginalized and put off to the sides. They weren't leading anything. They were staying relatively calm. And white people were able to run rampant around the globe as America was kind of coming into its own. And, right, that's the challenge, not only with that episode from the Newsroom, but that's the challenge with Jesus and John Wayne, and that's the challenge with the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which is when we center these critiques in a way that doesn't acknowledge how these systemic problems have been deeply rooted in our society and their bipartisan values, and our nation has used them, both the left and the right, to suppress not only women, but people of color and other marginalized communities throughout the entire history of this nation. We end up thinking our problems are only been in existence for the past few decades, instead of recognizing, no, this is a machine that's been moving. And I've said this before, right? The only people who can look back on American history with any sense of nostalgia whatsoever is white people, and specifically white landowning men. For everyone else, our past is worse, right? Our past is worse, especially if you go back to the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? You can't even compare them if you talk to people of color. And so this is where I'm trying to, without dismissing the good work, right? There's definitely some critique and value of what is going on with the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and that Christianity Today, which is a white evangelical organization, is looking critically at what happened in its own backyard. And while, authors like Kristen Demay and others are very strongly calling out the patriarchy and the misogyny and the white Christian nationalism that it's fruit it's borne in the past few decades, when we treat those things in silos and forget that these things are not partisan problems, they're bipartisan values that have been used to suppress people of color and women for not just decades, but for centuries. And that we can't just go back a few decades and say, oh, things used to be better, and look at now this mess we have today. No. And that's where the critique becomes much harder. Because both Democrats and Republicans love to believe and perpetuate the myth that our history is great. We may not be great today, but our history is great. And Democrats say that just as loudly as Republicans do, if not even louder, because they have to convince people of color, more of whom vote Democratic than Republican, that the history was great, or at least wasn't as bad as they want to remember it as being. And so I just wanted to point those things out I've been digesting a lot over the weekend, and it's been a lot of things to kind of think through and kind of process through. And I'm going to begin to sort them out over my second cups of coffee over the next few weeks and even months. But I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm thinking and of some of the dialogue I want to have here. Because I really want to find a way to move this thing forward, right? Which means I want to engage with people who are doing some really good work, right? Kristen Demay's book is really good. I'm not knocking her book. But I am saying we have to put it in context. What happened in the past few decades didn't corrupt a faith and bring in brand new problems, right? This is something that's been going on since the foundations of this nation, right? Abraham Lincoln was using and doing these things. And so I want to deepen the dialogue in that way so that we're not just thinking, oh, our problems are new, or at least only a few decades old, instead of recognizing, no, we've had these problems for centuries. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I really appreciate you taking time to join me. I'm appreciating this chance to sit and talk with you for a little bit. And I'm not sure what my schedule is going to be like for the week. I'll definitely do a few more cups of coffee, but my daughters are on spring break this week, and so we'll be doing a few more things as a family. And I won't be keeping quite the same schedule I do during a normal week. But yeah, I'll definitely be back on at least one or two more times this week, I hope. But I hope you have a good day, my relatives. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.